gentlemen, this is JudgeSpektre, and I'm bringing to you now my thoughts on Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic 2, The Sith Lords. The sequel to the original Knights of the Old Republic, which was made by BioWare, and was considered by many to be the best game of 2003, RPG or not. Now, BioWare themselves didn't actually make this game, however, development itself was handled by Obsidian. And this caused a lot of people to become concerned that Obsidian was going to butcher Knights of the Old Republic. And to that I can say that that certainly didn't happen. They stuck very close to the formula that BioWare laid out, which proved to be one of its strong points, but perhaps one of its weakest ones as well. And I will talk more about that later. But for now I want to elaborate a little bit on the storyline, which picks up 5 years after the close of the original. The Republic is now in a state of collapse, and you begin the game as supposedly the last surviving Jedi Knight, although technically not a Jedi Knight, as your character was sent into exile after the Mandalorian Wars. Now, for the sake of avoiding massive spoilers for anyone who hasn't played it, I won't go into overwhelming detail about it. I'll just say that the storyline itself is very different from the first game. Knights of the Old Republic, for all the talk about it, the storyline was just essentially good versus evil, with your character choosing between one of those two extremes by the end of the game. It certainly wasn't a bad storyline. As a matter of fact, I thought it was a rather good one, but it does tend to be a bit overrated in my eyes. Knights of the Old Republic 2 has a very different feel to it. And in order to illustrate this properly, I'm going to play a very short clip of a conversation between your main character and your mentor, Kreia, who, when you find her, is a mysterious old woman who is supposedly has force powers, but you're not entirely sure whether she's a Jedi or a Sith. And when she's asked this question by you, she responds in the following way.
Does it matter? Of course it does. Such titles allow you to break the galaxy into light and dark, categorize it. Perhaps I am neither, and I hold both as what they are, pieces of a whole. Know that I am your teacher, and that is enough.
I found that Kreia was a very interesting character to me. She always knew more than she let on. She was working with you, but out of her own personal motivations, she had an interest to see things arrive at a very specific destination, and all the while she was manipulating events behind the scenes with an invisible hand to ensure that they got there. Finding out what her in-game objective was a big motivation for me to see how this whole thing was going to end up. And the storyline in general just had a lot more shades of gray thrown onto it than the original had. Always the sense of sort of good isn't always good, and evil may not always necessarily be evil, at least not the way you see it. I found that this was a very fresh idea, and I thought that it worked very well. However, this storyline does have its share of problems. There are a few that I noticed almost right off the bat. Considering you're playing a different character, you actually get to choose what happened in the first game, whether your main character was good or evil. But the problem is, the game starts out the exact same way anyhow. And if your character was good, why are the Jedi all still extinct? That doesn't really make much sense. It seems to almost imply that your main character was evil without actually saying it, because the entire game begins sort of under the premise that the Sith were almost sort of victorious in the first game. But I do suppose that it's easy enough to look past that. And sadly, another problem I had with this game was in the department of the actual characters. Now, if you recall, in the original Knights of the Old Republic, you had quite an interesting cast of characters in your group. And each one sort of had their own personality traits and their own backstory, and by talking to them, you got to learn about them. And it was interesting discovering their histories and what led them to where they were at. And there were even quests that you could undertake once you had learned enough about them. I can't really recall too many characters in that game which really felt like they really didn't have anything under the hood, except maybe the droid T3, because apart from the beginning of the game when you get him, you really don't use him for anything else, really. Sadly, in Knights of the Old Republic 2, the characters are nowhere near as interesting. In fact, several of them feel like they're just in your party to perform one specific action at a specific point in the game, and that's more or less it. They don't really have much else to contribute beyond that. And several of them just feel like they're just blank voids. But there is a bright spot. The lovable homicidal assassin droid from Knights of the Old Republic Part 1, HK-47, does make a return appearance if you make the effort to rebuild him, and I'm pleased to say that his dialogue is as funny and crazy as ever, so it was definitely a plus to have him back again. And there were a few other characters, such as Mira and possibly Atten, which had some level of depth to them, but a lot of the other ones didn't have this and just felt like they were there just to be there. And sadly, the main villains are also somewhat of a disappointment. There are 3 Sith Lords in this game: Darth Traya, Darth Sion, and Darth Nihilus. And as far as Darth Sion goes, you never really learn too much about him, but truth be told, you never learn too much about Malik from the first game either, so I can't really say that I had a big problem with this guy. I thought he was a decent villain, and he had some interesting character traits about him. However, sadly, there's one other villain in this game which I thought was completely wasted, and that was Darth Nihilus. Now, he's actually in the background cover of the game box, and he has a very great, creepy, ominous presence about him, but he only shows up at 2 different points in the game, I think, and you fight him and that's it. You never really learn much about him. And some may say that that's a strength, but I thought that there was a great story to be told with his character, and I thought that it was kind of wasted. There was a lot that we could have learned, but didn't. Now, once you actually move away from the story itself, unfortunately you'll find that there is very little that actually separates this game from the first Knights of the Old Republic. Maybe the graphics are better, but if they are, I can't tell. I thought the voiceover work was equally as good as what was done in the first game, no better and no worse. Once again, the original music sounds about the same. The gameplay itself, apart from a few tweaks, seems to be more or less the same. Although I did appreciate the fact that they made switching between weapons much easier this time, as one thing BioWare was disappointed with was that most people only used one weapon throughout the entire game because you had to go to the menu to switch. In Knights of the Old Republic 2, they made it much smoother. They added a way to equip 2 different sets of weapons, so with the click of a button, you could switch between using a double-bladed lightsaber and using a blaster rifle. It definitely made using 2 different sets of weapons much easier and much more fun than the first game. But apart from that, almost every area of Knights of the Old Republic 2 is completely identical to Knights of the Old Republic Part 1. At times, it'll almost feel like you're playing an expansion pack rather than a sequel. There's very little difference between the 2 games. And some might say that's a strength, and to some extent I may agree with that, but I also would have liked to have seen more variation. On second thought, there may actually have been one thing that was strikingly different, and that was the fact that, unlike the first game, this one really just doesn't feel complete. Because of the press of the release date, large amounts of content were cut from this game. As a result, there were at least 1 or 2 quests which were left completely unfinishable. In addition, the ending to this game was completely anticlimactic and seemed to scream sequel. The only problem is there was never a sequel made. Instead, now we have reports of Star Wars The Old Republic being made on PC as an MMO. And if it continues the storyline from these 2 games, I'm going to be very upset about that, because this game originated on consoles. It did go to PC, but to the best of my knowledge, it was released on Xbox first. And now, console owners aren't going to be able to experience the storyline on any other way except looking it up on YouTube or somewhere. And if that's the case, I can't help but feel a little bit robbed and insulted at that.